When David married Emily, he thought love would solve everything. He loved her deeply, and he wanted nothing more than to give her a safe, happy life. But what he hadn't expected was the quiet wall that stood between him and her 12-year-old son, Ethan. The boy had big brown eyes that carried a sadness David could never ignore. Ethan had lost his real father 3 years ago, and in his heart, no one could ever take that place. From the very first day, David noticed the way Ethan looked at him, polite but distant, as if David was a guest who had overstayed his welcome. At the dinner table, Ethan barely spoke. When David asked simple questions about school, Ethan would give one-word answers, then turn his focus back to his plate. The boys' room door was almost always closed, and sometimes David would hear faint music playing, songs Ethan used to listen to with his father. That sound cut David's heart, reminding him that he was living in a space built on memories that didn't include him. But David wasn't angry. He understood. He knew love couldn't be forced, so he chose silence, patience, and quiet acts of care. When Ethan's bike chain broke, David fixed it in the garage without saying a word. When the boy's favorite sneakers ripped, David worked an extra hour at his job and bought him a new pair, leaving them by the door without taking credit. Every gesture was small, almost invisible, but it was David's way of saying, "I may not be your father, but I'll be here for you, no matter what." To Ethan, though, David was still just Mom's husband. Nothing more, nothing less. But to David, Ethan was already his son in every sense of the word. He just had to prove it, not with words, but with time, sacrifice, and a love that asked for nothing in return. And so, in that quiet, complicated silence between them, their story truly began. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. But the distance between David and Ethan never seemed to shrink. David tried to keep things light, asking about soccer practice, offering to help with homework, even suggesting they build something together in the garage. But Ethan's answers were always short, guarded, and sometimes filled with a quiet resentment. It wasn't that the boy was rude. He was simply protecting the memory of his real father. In Ethan's eyes, opening up to David almost felt like betraying the man he'd lost. Emily saw the struggle, but she didn't push. She knew healing takes time. Still, at night, she would sometimes hold David's hand and whisper, "Just be patient with him. He's been through so much." And David would nod, though deep inside, he wished Ethan could see the truth, that he wasn't here to replace anyone, but to stand beside him. One evening, while Emily was working late, David prepared dinner. He set the table neatly, made Ethan's favorite mac and cheese, and even added a little dessert. When Ethan came down, he glanced at the table, then at David, and said quietly, "Mom usually makes it better." Those words stung, but David smiled and replied softly, "You're probably right, but I'm learning." He didn't argue, didn't show his hurt, and simply let the boy eat in peace. Later that night, David found Ethan's baseball glove torn along the seam. Instead of telling Ethan, he stayed up late at the kitchen table, carefully stitching it back together with the little sewing kit Emily kept in the drawer. The next morning, when Ethan found it, his brows furrowed. He didn't say thank you, he just picked it up, slipped it onto his hand, and walked away. But what David didn't see was the way Ethan paused on the stairs, staring at the neat stitches, wondering why this man cared enough to do something so small. For the first time, Ethan's heart wavered. He still wasn't ready to call David Dad, but he began to realize something he hadn't admitted before. This man wasn't trying to take away his father's place. Maybe, just maybe, he was trying to earn a place of his own. It was a chilly Saturday morning when Ethan's soccer team had their biggest game of the season. The bleachers were filled with cheering parents, waving banners and clapping loudly for their kids. Emily was caught up at work again, so David showed up alone, quietly slipping into the back row, not wanting to embarrass Ethan by being too visible. He didn't bring a banner, he didn't shout, he didn't try to force himself into Ethan's world. He just sat there, hands clasped together, eyes following the boy's every move. Ethan spotted him from the field, and for a second, his chest tightened. Part of him wished David wasn't there. After all, this was something his real dad used to do. But another part of him noticed something different. David wasn't trying to be the center of attention. He wasn't trying to act like he belonged. He was just there, watching, supporting. The game grew tense. Ethan missed an important goal, and a few kids on the opposing team started teasing him. His shoulders dropped, his steps slowed, and he looked like he wanted to walk off the field. From the stands, David leaned forward, his lips pressing into a thin line, but he stayed quiet. He didn't yell, didn't argue with the kids, didn't even try to shout encouragement. Instead, when Ethan glanced toward the bleachers, David gave a small, firm nod, the kind of look that said, "I believe in you, no matter what." Something shifted inside Ethan. He clenched his fists, took a deep breath and pushed himself harder. Minutes later, he stole the ball, weaving past two players, and this time, when he struck, the ball sailed perfectly into the net. The crowd erupted, but Ethan didn't hear the cheers. His eyes instinctively flicked toward the back row. There was David, still sitting quietly, a proud smile tugging at his lips. He didn't clap the loudest. He didn't stand on the bench. He just smiled, as if to say, "I knew you could do it." After the game, the team gathered with their families. Kids rushed into their parents' arms, shouting excitedly. Ethan walked out slowly, his medal dangling from his neck. David approached cautiously, unsure if he should say something. Before he could speak, Ethan muttered, almost under his breath, "Thanks for coming." It wasn't much, just 4 words. But to David, it felt like a wall had cracked. Just enough for light to seep through. That night, when Emily asked how the game went, Ethan didn't talk about the goal. He simply said David was there, and for the first time, his voice didn't carry annoyance or resistance. It carried something softer, something closer to acceptance. A week after the soccer game, Ethan found himself in the middle of a storm. Not outside, but inside his own heart. Middle school wasn't easy. Between assignments piling up and kids whispering about his stepdad, Ethan felt like he was carrying too much. His real dad's memory still lingered in the back of his mind, making him believe that no one could ever replace him. One rainy evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his math book wide open, his pencil tapping anxiously against the page. Numbers blurred together until they looked like a foreign language. Emily wasn't home yet, caught up in late meetings. David noticed Ethan's struggle from the living room but didn't rush in. He hesitated. He didn't want to overstep, didn't want to make the boy feel pressured. But after a long moment, he walked over quietly, pulling out the chair across from him. "You stuck?" David asked gently. Ethan rolled his eyes. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his clenched fists said otherwise. David didn't push. Instead, he reached for a scrap piece of paper, pulled out a pen, and began working through the problem himself. He didn't explain it right away. He just solved it slowly, step by step, in silence. Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. He leaned over, watching carefully. "Wait, how did you do that?" David slid the paper across the table. "Try it this way. No rush. You'll get it." For the next hour, something rare happened. They worked side by side. David didn't act like a teacher, didn't overwhelm Ethan with lectures. He let him struggle, guided him when he was stuck, and smiled when Ethan finally scribbled down the right answer. For the first time, Ethan felt like someone wasn't trying to replace his dad, wasn't trying to take over. David was just there, helping in the quiet way he always did. Later that night, Ethan heard the sound of rain pounding harder outside. The wind howled, rattling the windows. Suddenly there was a loud crack, and then darkness. The power had gone out. Ethan froze. He hated storms. Memories of being small, hiding under his blanket, came rushing back. He didn't want to admit it, but fear gripped him. David noticed. Without a word, he grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, walked into Ethan's room, and set it on the nightstand. He didn't make a big speech, didn't tease him for being scared. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the thunder roll. "You know," David said softly, "storms don't last forever. They just sound scarier than they are." Ethan lay under his blanket, peeking out. He didn't reply, but his breathing slowed. The storm raged on, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone. When Emily returned home and peeked into Ethan's room, she found David still sitting there in the dim light, keeping watch like a silent protector. That night, Ethan whispered something into his pillow before drifting off to sleep. It was so quiet that only he could hear it. Maybe he really does care. The morning after the storm, Ethan felt different. He wouldn't admit it, but something about David sitting by his bed all night had softened a corner of his guarded heart. Still, a voice inside reminded him not to trust too quickly. What if he leaves like everyone else? What if Mom ends up hurt again? The only way to know was to test him. At school, Ethan came home later than usual. His backpack was half unzipped, papers spilling out, his shoes caked in mud. Emily had called earlier, reminding him about dinner, but Ethan dragged his feet, knowing full well that David would be waiting. When he walked through the door, David glanced up from the stove. He was stirring spaghetti sauce, the kind Emily always said tasted better when simmered slowly. "Hey, Champ, you're late. Everything okay?" "Don't call me Champ," Ethan snapped, tossing his bag on the floor. "And yeah, whatever." David didn't flinch. He stirred the sauce calmly, the aroma of garlic filling the air. "Rough day?" he asked. Ethan shrugged, slumping into a chair. He kicked the table leg hard enough to make it shake. He wanted a reaction. He wanted yelling, or at least anger. Anything that would prove David was only pretending to care. But David stayed steady. He ladled sauce onto the pasta and placed a plate in front of Ethan. "Eat first," We can talk later." Ethan glared at the plate, refusing to touch it. Minutes passed. His stomach growled, but his pride kept him still. Finally, he pushed the plate away. "I'm not hungry." David didn't argue. He just covered the food and left it on the counter. "It'll be here when you are." Then he walked into the living room and turned on a small lamp, settling into his worn recliner with a book. That night, Ethan snuck into the kitchen. He opened the fridge, and there it was, the same plate, carefully wrapped, waiting for him. He heated it quietly, and as he sat alone at the table, a strange feeling crept in. He remembered the nights when his mom had worked late, when he'd eaten cold cereal by himself because no one had cooked for him. And now, someone had made sure he didn't go hungry. The next day, Ethan tried again. This time, he deliberately forgot his homework at school, knowing it would spark trouble. When Emily asked about it, Ethan shrugged. "I lost it." Emily sighed. She looked tired, drained from work. But before she could scold him, David spoke. "It's fine. We'll go back to school after dinner. Maybe it's still in your locker." Ethan blinked. "You'd drive me back at night?" "Of course." David replied simply. "Homework matters, and so do you." Ethan didn't know what to say. No yelling, no lectures, no punishment, just quiet persistence. It was as if David had drawn a line in the sand, not with anger, but with patience. And for the first time, Ethan realized if I push, he doesn't push back, he just stays. That night, lying awake in bed, Ethan wondered if maybe, just maybe, David wasn't pretending after all. It was a chilly Friday afternoon when Ethan's class was dismissed early. The playground outside the school buzzed with kids running, laughing, and waiting for their parents. Ethan walked out with his hands stuffed into his pockets, feeling restless. His friends had already left and Emily was stuck at work. That's when he noticed a group of older boys by the fence. They weren't from his grade, taller, louder, and known for trouble. One of them pointed at Ethan's old backpack, the strap fraying at the edges. "Nice bag, kid. Did you pull that out of the trash?" One sneered. Ethan's stomach tightened. He wanted to fire back, but something in their eyes told him it would only get worse. He tried to walk past, but they blocked his way. "Come on, let's see what you've got in there," another boy said, tugging at his strap. Ethan pulled back. "Leave me alone." The boys laughed. One shoved him lightly, just enough to test how far they could go. Ethan's heart pounded. He thought of his real dad, how he might have taught him to stand tall, to fight back, but his dad wasn't here. He never had been. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air, calm, deep, unshakable. "Hey, that's enough." The boys froze. Standing just a few feet away was David. He wasn't shouting, wasn't angry, just standing tall, his presence filling the space. His eyes, steady and firm, locked on the boys. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the older kids scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and they scattered, kicking at the dirt as they left. Ethan blinked, stunned. He hadn't even seen David arrive. You were here?" Ethan asked, still catching his breath. David gave a small shrug. "I was waiting by the truck, saw you taking a little longer than usual." He didn't lecture, didn't ask why Ethan hadn't stood up for himself. Instead, he just nodded toward the street. "Let's go home." Ethan followed in silence, his backpack still hanging from one shoulder. Inside, his emotions twisted. Part of him was embarrassed that David had to step in, but a bigger part felt safe, protected in a way he hadn't felt in years. On the drive home, Ethan kept stealing glances at David. He wanted to say thank you, but the words stuck in his throat. David didn't push, he just drove, one hand steady on the wheel, the other tapping softly against the dashboard in rhythm with the radio. That night, while Emily set the table for dinner, Ethan slipped away to his room. He sat on his bed, staring at the floor, replaying the moment again and again. The way David had handled it, not with fists, not with shouting, but with quiet strength. For the first time, Ethan wondered if maybe strength didn't always mean being loud or aggressive. Maybe it meant being steady, like a wall you could lean on when everything else felt shaky. And without realizing it, Ethan whispered to himself he didn't have to step in, but he did. Saturday morning sunlight poured through the kitchen window, painting the room in warm gold. Emily stood at the counter, whisking pancake batter, humming quietly to herself. It was their little tradition, Saturday pancakes. Usually, Ethan dragged his feet, coming down late, half-heartedly mumbling a good morning before disappearing into his phone. But today was different. He came down earlier than usual, his hair still messy, wearing an oversized hoodie. He slid into his seat at the table, glancing briefly at David, who was sipping coffee and reading the morning paper. "Morning," Ethan muttered. David looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Morning, kid." Emily paused mid-whisk. her eyebrows raising slightly. It wasn't the word itself. Ethan had said morning before. It was the tone, softer, less guarded. She filed the observation away without saying anything, not wanting to break the fragile moment. As the pancake sizzled on the pan, David folded his paper. "You've got practice today, right?" he asked casually. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, coach moved it to noon. You need a ride?" There was a pause. Normally, Ethan would have said, "Mom will take me," or "I'll figure it out," but instead he hesitated, then said quietly, "If you're not busy." "Yeah, sure." Emily nearly dropped the spatula. She kept her face neutral, but inside, her heart warmed. This was new. This was progress. Later that day at the field, Ethan ran drills with his team, while David sat quietly on the bleachers. He didn't yell like some parents, didn't try to give instructions. He just watched, hands resting on his knees, an easy calm about him. When Ethan tripped during a play and scraped his elbow, David was the first to stand. He jogged over, knelt beside him, and checked the scrape. "Nothing serious," he said, brushing the dirt away gently. "But we'll clean it when we get home." Ethan didn't pull away. He didn't roll his eyes or protest. He just nodded, letting David help him up. Emily, who had arrived a few minutes later, noticed it instantly. The way Ethan stood a little taller beside David. The way he looked at him, not with resentment but with something else, something softer. That evening after dinner, Emily found Ethan in the living room scrolling on his phone. She sat beside him, nudging him lightly. "You were good today at practice," she said. Ethan shrugged. "Yeah, I guess." "You know," Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "David really cares. He doesn't always say much, but he's there. You see that, right?" For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, he whispered, "Yeah, I see it." Emily's chest tightened. She didn't push further. She just smiled, placed a gentle kiss on his forehead, and whispered, "That's all I wanted to hear." In the quiet of that night, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the look in David's eyes when he stood up to those bullies, the calm way he watched practice, the steady hand that checked his elbow. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't fall asleep feeling alone. The car hummed quietly as David drove down the winding road from Ethan's practice. The late afternoon sun painted streaks of orange and pink across the sky, and the world outside seemed unusually calm. Inside the car, though, silence sat between them like a heavy cloud. David glanced at Ethan, who was staring out the passenger window, earbuds loosely hanging around his neck. He debated whether to speak or let the quiet be. For weeks, he had learned that forcing conversations only pushed Ethan further away. But today, something felt different. "You played hard out there," David said finally, his voice steady but gentle. Ethan shifted in his seat, still watching the scenery pass. "Thanks," he muttered, almost too low to hear. David nodded, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. He didn't push, but he also didn't want to let the moment slip. "You've got a good eye on the field," he added. "The way you read that last play, smart, reminded me of when I used to play." That caught Ethan's attention. He turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at David. "You played?" A small smile curved on David's lips. "Yeah, high school. Quarterback. Thought I was hot stuff back then." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Didn't exactly go pro, but I loved the game." For the first time, Ethan smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "Mom never mentioned that. She probably thought it wasn't worth bragging about," David teased lightly. Then his tone softened. "But I see that same drive in you. You've got something special, Ethan, more than I ever had." The words landed heavier than David expected. Ethan shifted again, fiddling with the string of his hoodie. For so long, he had built walls around himself, convinced that no one cared enough to notice him beyond his mistakes or attitude. But here was David, quiet, steady David, who had been watching all along. "Why do you even care?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice cracking just slightly. It wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was vulnerable, like a child finally letting the question slip. David's grip on the wheel loosened, and he exhaled slowly. "Because you matter to me," he said, his tone unwavering. "You're not just your mom's son, Ethan. You're my family too, and I don't care how long it takes. I'll always show up for you." The car fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy, it was thoughtful. Ethan swallowed hard, staring at the road ahead. For the first time, he felt the sincerity in David's words settle into the cracks of his guarded heart. When they pulled into the driveway, Ethan didn't immediately get out. He lingered, hand on the door handle before whispering, "Thanks for today." David looked at him, eyes softening, and simply nodded. "Anytime, kid." Ethan walked into the house that night carrying something new. Not just exhaustion from practice, but the unfamiliar warmth of being seen. The next day at school, Ethan walked through the buzzing cafeteria with his lunch tray, his usual group of friends trailing behind him. They grabbed a table near the back, the one where they always sat, laughing a little too loud and talking about everything from sports to video games. It was routine until one of his friends, Kyle, smirked and said, "So Ethan, how's life with the stepdad? Still weird having a stranger try to play dad?" The words hit harder than Ethan expected. Normally, he would have shrugged it off, maybe even laughed along to avoid the awkwardness. That's what he always did. Pretend it didn't matter. Pretend David didn't matter. But today, he couldn't. Images from last night flooded his mind. David's steady voice telling him he mattered. The way he'd driven him home like it was the most natural thing in the world. The quiet sincerity in his eyes when he said, "You're family to me." Ethan put down his fork slowly and looked up. "He's not a stranger," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. The group quieted, surprised. Kyle raised an eyebrow. "What, you actually like the guy now?" He snickered. "Man, I'd never let some random dude boss me around just 'cause he married my mom." Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't ready to admit out loud what he was starting to feel, but at the same time, he felt a fire burn in him, a protective instinct he didn't know existed until now. "He's not like that," Ethan said firmly. His voice didn't shake. "David doesn't try to boss me around. He just shows up. Every time. For my mom. For me." Kyle and the others exchanged glances, clearly taken aback. For once, Ethan wasn't just brushing it off, he was standing his ground. "Whoa," another friend, Marcus, said carefully. "Didn't know you felt that way." Ethan exhaled, picking his fork back up. "Yeah, well, maybe you don't know everything." The table fell quiet for a moment before the boys shifted the conversation back to football and weekend plans. But Ethan stayed quiet, his mind racing. It wasn't about impressing his friends. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about realizing that for the first time, he didn't want David to be dismissed like he didn't matter. Because to Ethan, David was beginning to matter more than he had ever admitted, even to himself. When he got home that evening, David was in the kitchen helping his mom prep dinner. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them laugh softly together. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like an outsider in his own house. He felt like he belonged, and deep down, he knew. Respect wasn't something David had demanded. It was something he had earned. It was Saturday morning, and the house was still wrapped in the hush of early dawn. Ethan shuffled into the kitchen, hair messy, hoodie zipped up halfway, expecting to find the usual silence. Instead, he found David already awake, standing over the stove. The smell of sizzling bacon filled the air. "Morning, kid," David said without turning around, flipping a strip of bacon with ease. "Couldn't sleep? Figured I'd make breakfast." Ethan blinked, a little stunned. For years, breakfast had always been grab and go, cereal, maybe toast if he was lucky. But here was David, humming softly under his breath, cooking like it was second nature. Morning," Ethan muttered, sliding into a chair at the table. He fiddled with the sleeve of his hoodie, watching the scene with quiet curiosity. David glanced over his shoulder with a small grin. "Hope you're hungry. Big day ahead, huh? Scrimmage game, right?" Ethan's chest tightened. He hadn't even mentioned the scrimmage at school. Not to his mom. Not to anyone. Yet somehow, David knew. "Yeah," Ethan said cautiously. "Coach said I might start." "That's huge," David replied, sliding scrambled eggs onto a plate. "I'll be there. Front row if I can get it." Ethan froze, fork halfway to his mouth. "You're coming?" "Of course," David said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Wouldn't miss it. The words sank deep into Ethan's heart, stirring emotions he had long kept buried. His father had promised to come to games too, so many times, and almost every time, he never showed. But here was David, not making empty promises, not talking big, just quietly, consistently showing up. Ethan stared at his plate for a long moment before finally blurting out, "Thanks." David paused, spatula in hand, then set it down. He turned to Ethan, his expression warm but careful, like he didn't want to scare the moment away. "For what?" "For," Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "For being here. For not giving up on me." The kitchen fell quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward but heavy with meaning. David pulled out the chair across from Ethan and sat down. He didn't rush to respond. He didn't make it dramatic. He just placed a steady hand on the table and said, "There's nowhere else I'd rather be, Ethan." For the first time, Ethan didn't look away. He met David's gaze and held it. And in that silent exchange, something shifted, not forced, not demanded, but freely given. Respect. It was the beginning of something real. Moral lesson. The greatest message of this story is that blood relation is not everything. True bonds are built through love, honesty, and sacrifice. Stepfathers or stepmothers may often feel like outsiders in a family, but real respect and love are earned by those who quietly carry the burdens of their family without complaint. This story teaches us that if our intentions are pure, if we sacrifice and support our loved ones without seeking recognition, then one day, even those who once doubted us will begin to respect and accept us as their own.